Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, my guest today, I'm very pleased to say, is almost one of our regulars. Peter Hitchens, the columnist and author, is with me now. Thank you very much indeed for coming, Peter. It was about 3 months ago we talked about the police.
Yes.
But the time before that, we were taken off because we were talking about COVID and all of that sort of thing.
Yes, we mustn't do that.
No, quite. This week we've seen lots of restrictions come off, and the whole feeling is of the thing falling apart a bit, in other countries in Europe as well. And your position, as you put it in that particular interview we did, was quite simply that you thought the response to it was disproportionate and that the government hadn't really proved its case for these kind of measures, lockdown and what have you. Do you feel now vindicated?
No, because I think an awful lot of people still believe that the thing was justified. The way in which the argument is presented in most cases is the way in which it was presented throughout, with what seems to me to be a presentation of the facts which I would in many cases dispute, which gives the impression that a larger event took place than one that did. It's dangerous even to say that too, because to suggest that it was exaggerated is immediately to be accused of claiming it didn't happen. Yeah. Because there's no subtlety in argument anymore. You're either totally signed up to the official view, or if you're a critic of it, you're a denier and a disinformation purveyor. And that's where you are. So all that still persists. Any kind of criticism of the proportionality of the reaction isn't treated as such. It's treated as objection to the whole thing. And almost immediately you're also accused of all kinds of other positions you haven't taken. So people say, oh, well, you must be against vaccination and so forth. So all that still persists. If, for instance, it were asserted in a couple of weeks' time that a new variant had arrived, which required the shutdown of the country again, then I'd be back very much in a despised minority, so vindicated not by any means.
No. I suppose I was thinking of, I've seemed to notice journalists, at least some other journalists, now at least questioning things that have happened over the past 2 years, where once upon a time they wouldn't have done that. The general tone of things seems to have changed a bit, I would have thought.
Well, yeah, that's great, isn't it? Some months after the fire has been put out, a few people turn up with tin mugs and empty them on top of the embers. They could have been more used at the time. But of course, everybody, well, I say everybody, most people fit in with the spirit of the age, and the spirit of the age is now to say, oh, well, maybe we did go a little bit far. But fundamentally, when the report is completed on this, I carry on predicting this. The report will say, we did not lock down soon enough, we did not lock down hard enough. The whole principle of shutting down the country to contain a disease will continue to be accepted as correct.
Do you find that experience of the past couple of years has altered your opinion of this country in any way?
A bit, though not all that much. I mean, I've noticed, particularly during the Blair attempts to undermine and dismantle the liberties of the country, that there wasn't anything like as much objection to these things as I had thought instinctively that there would be, and I felt instinctively. For instance, the longer and longer periods of detention without trial, which the Blair government wanted in the name of fighting terrorism, were outrageous. And I thought that also the getting rid of several of the protections which we ought to have against being prosecuted twice for the same alleged crime, and the total right to silence which we used to possess. These things, I thought they were taken away with very little fuss. So I wasn't as surprised as I would otherwise have been by the fact that when people were told fundamentally your liberties are gone until we decide to give them back to you, people didn't care much. I was shocked by one thing. I wasn't shocked by the feebleness of the opposition. I knew it was feeble. I wasn't shocked by the feebleness of Parliament. I'm constantly astonished by how the weakness and ignorance of the people who populate that chamber. But I was shocked by the impossibility of making any kind of legal challenge to what the government had done. The courts would not even hear a case for a judicial review of the government's action. Now, I just think that's ridiculous, given what the judicial reviews they've permitted on the European issue, quite rightly in my view. They should have done it, but the courts really did surprise me by not even being prepared to consider it. I mean, who knows what would have happened if they had, but they didn't, and that did surprise me.
So, when it comes to public people, the liberty aspect of things, is you say people didn't really seem to care very much.
No, they didn't.
Do you put that down to the fact that people just simply don't know about these things anymore?
Yes. David Cameron used to go on about how we should have a British Bill of Rights, and we have one. We've had one since 1689, and here was a man who'd actually become Prime Minister, been educated at Eton and Oxford, and didn't know we had one.
Also didn't know what the Magna Carta meant.
He said so. Yeah, I don't know. It may have been an elaborate joke, but I'm not sure. I think you could now come right the way through the education system without knowing these things. You couldn't when I was growing up, but you can now.
I suppose that my feeling is, it may be a sentimental one, but it was a sort of feeling that I thought British people would have a bit more truculence about them when it came to having things enforced on them.
Yeah, it's gone. I think, as I say, that's what's became apparent. And the other things which I'd always noticed, the ridiculous restrictions which are placed on people who travel by air. You go to the airport, and from the moment you arrive, you're treated as if you're being processed for incarceration. Humiliated, you have your testicles x-rayed, and you're made to take your clothes off and undo your trousers and all these other nonsensical things, which don't even make sense on a rational basis. And people just put up with it. And if occasionally, if you're going through this, you let out a minor mutter of protest, the chances are that the person standing next to you will say, well, it's all for your own good. Would you really rather not, these things were not really here? Would you like to fly on a plane where these precautions were not taken? And so which one replies, actually, I wouldn't mind at all, because I don't think that these things do any good. But I realized as this happened that people were not merely prepared to put up with it and didn't see it as outrageous, but also that they quite liked it.
Quite liked it. So presumably quite like wearing masks.
Well, there are a lot of people who plainly do. And when the restrictions have been off, or when they are taken off, people continue to wear them in places where they're not required to. And many people wear them outside.
Yes. I've never got that. You know, there are some things that actually cast one down a bit. And seeing people, and I see especially young people, walking along the street on their own with a mask. No one has actually ever asked you even to have.
It's a proclamation.
Yeah.
They're saying, because remember, the official propaganda for the masks is you're doing it for others. And what people are doing is saying, I'm doing this for you. And they're proud of themselves.
What damage or what changes do you think are going to be permanent?
Hard to tell. And we're going through quite a struggle at the moment because we have a government which has to some extent recovered its reason. This is why I think that Johnson is now under attack. I'm not a friend of Johnson. I continue to be highly critical of him. And if I'd got hold of these stories about parties in Downing Street during the shutdown, I would have publicised them and pointed out that they showed clearly that the people in charge of it didn't believe in their own propaganda. But though nobody leaked them then, there must have been the people who knew about them then, and they didn't leak them then. They're leaking them now to damage Johnson, precisely at the point when actually he's out of step with the rest of the United Kingdom nations, and also out of step with most of Europe in being more relaxed. And I think it's relaxation which is causing this. I think it's the enemies of relaxation who are now turning on him.
Would they be, no, this is just a hunch, but are those the enemies of relaxation? Like, are they the same sort of people as would be Remainers?
Well, I don't know. There's probably an overlap.
It seems to me there is.
But being someone who overlaps within himself as a friend of the Norway option, it's not something which really grabs me. And plainly, there is some congruence And it's very interesting, and I noticed this, and Janice Turner also in the Times the other day did. Mark Drakeford, the Welsh First Minister, gave an extraordinary interview on BBC a few days ago, in which he said that the people of Wales were more collective than the people of England, and more concerned and less concerned with individual freedom than Conservatives. And what Janice Turner noted was just the considerable venom he put into saying this. I think it's quite clear that there is, among those who are more collective, more communitarian, more of the traditional left, which believes that you hand over your liberties to the state in return for safety. There is a profound political division in this country, and in Wales and Scotland, I think it's much more on the collective side, and it always has been. In England, it's more balanced, but I think it's quite clear from what Mr. Drakeford said that we are actually engaged here in a battle between collective authoritarianism and the old-fashioned liberty under the law.
Well, that's I've heard you say. I think the way you put it was that it was proclaiming a different world view. Is that right?
Completely, yeah, I think absolutely do think so. But most people don't understand that they have worldviews, but they have them. And I think an awful lot of people, to go back to your original question, an awful lot of people who liked the European Union and our membership of it were the same people who like collectivism and who like a strong state. A lot of people do. It's not. That's why the referendum was such a close division, because really for the first time in many years, instead of dividing on party lines, which are increasingly meaningless, the country divided on lines of real difference about what kind of country and world we should live in.
Also a different attitude to people, maybe.
Maybe, but if your attitude to people is that no, the best way of summing it up for me has always been the great saying: the secret of good government is to let men alone.
Yeah.
If you have that view, then you're going to be differing on lots of things from the person who believes that he is his brother's keeper.
Yes. But isn't it also, I thought about, there's a sort of, if you go through your average newspaper now, or even on the media, broadcast media, the word vulnerable comes up time and time again. It's part of our culture, I mean. And it's almost like the emphasis now is on sort of victimhood, care, vulnerability, not about sort of somehow strength or...
But how does one make a strong state appealing? You make a strong state appealing by stating that it will protect those who need protecting, that it will come to the aid of the weak, or the vulnerable, as you'd like to say. I've no doubt at all that in a more collective society, the old individual impulses for self-defense or anything like that have gone. And also we live in a world which in some ways is a good thing, though I'm not sure we can sustain it with our current policies, in which warfare and conquest are now pretty much abjured. So the person who we claim to admire military valor, but actually we're rather nervous about exercising it.
Yes.
We make a lot of fuss about it in the past, but if we actually had to provide it now, we might find that rather few people are willing to do it, because we haven't brought people up in the way that they used to be in believing in these things. And I'm still amused by the fact that when I was growing up in this country after the war, there were actually books about the Second World War for boys and girls called Men of Glory.
Yeah.
And More Men of Glory. These were written by Max Hastings, his father, MacDonald Hastings. And then for girls, there was a companion volume called Women of Glory. Can you imagine? It sounds like the Soviet Union, doesn't it? Glory.
Yes, it
But
does.
it seemed perfectly normal at the time, and these were all episodes of usually of martial courage, sometimes of the kind of martial courage where other people are rescued, but often people who just simply fought on long after they should have stopped.
Yeah. We have the situation going on at the moment with possible invasion of Ukraine, and indeed the government is saying things such as that we will always defend freedom and we will go to people's aid and defend freedom. But for all that bluster, the majority of the country seems really utterly indifferent about it.
Well, I think they possibly are, but part of the reason for indifference is that there's a profound ignorance of what's going on in Ukraine. I doubt whether most of the politicians who engage in this argument, or many of the journalists who do, could find Odessa on a map. If you gave them a blank map of the area, or a number of other features of it, well, people simply don't know. But that's a very small part of the Ukraine controversy.
Do you think we are on the verge of World War III?
No.
No? Why?
I don't think that Vladimir Putin is a madman. If he were staring mad, then he would invade Ukraine. In fact, he would probably have done so already. But in the modern world, the only country which can go around invading other people is the United States. Nobody else can do it without United Nations sanction, and he wouldn't get away with it. It would probably bring him down. It would quite possibly destroy Russia. And you could win without very much difficulty. I would have thought a swift war, even that might go wrong. You can never tell how wars will go until they happen. But having won it, what do you do next? You have to hold what you've captured. Ukrainians don't want to be ruled by Russia. They've made this perfectly plain, and most intelligent Russians realize this. I can't see what would be in it for Putin to launch something as crude as an invasion.
Do you know Ukraine?
Well, I've been there. I spent, in fact, some years before all this came, I went on a visit to Sevastopol and to the Donbass, to Donetsk itself, and to a fascinating town called Gorlovka, which is actually twinned with Barnsley. And has a cafe Barnsley in the middle of it, and to talk mainly to Russians living in Ukraine about their problems with doing so, because Ukrainian nationalism has been, how shall I put it, not particularly accommodating to Russians in Ukraine, especially recently in terms of language and status. And I foresaw, not very difficult to do, trouble. That was the last major time I went to Ukraine. When I was living in the Soviet Union, one would go down there to Crimea, which was never really Ukrainian, and to Kiev from time to time. But my most recent sustained trip was a few years before the trouble broke out, and I think I can say that I saw something coming, not this, but something, because the Ukraine it's been created out of a former Soviet republic. Its borders are completely not ideal for a nation state, not least because they contain, say, quite large Russian minorities. They were not designed for an independent country, and the only way it could work, and I think that the sensible, intelligent diplomacy which has been going on, this is working towards this, would be if Ukraine became a more federal state and gave Russians, particularly in the Don Basin, more autonomy. I think the Ukraine has lost Crimea for good. I don't think Russia will give it back without a very considerable fight, and I don't think that fight will happen. But I think the Russian-speaking East, which used to sustain the Party of the Regions, which basically kept Ukraine in balance before 2014, really does need some special consideration. And if people wanted peace in that area, the Minsk II agreement, which was intended to achieve something like that, should be pursued, but everyone seems to have let it die.
Putin has said that he thinks that the West is obsolete. And I wonder, when you look at the past year, Afghanistan, and also all the things that are going on internally in the West, when they do say, we will defend freedom and we have to act in this situation, you sort of can't help feeling, but do you actually still have the will and the capacity to act, even if you wanted to?
In what way is freedom the issue here? I mean, Ukraine is not exactly a law-governed democracy, and technically, it has elections, but journalists can run into trouble, and newspapers and broadcasters can face restriction. I believe that books, Anthony Beevor's book on Stalingrad, I think, ran into trouble over there. It's seriously corrupt. The former president is currently facing prosecution, having lost the election. This isn't really an issue of freedom versus tyranny that we're facing here. It's a much more complicated question, and the whole zone of Eastern Europe, which is no longer under Soviet domination, has not universally become a paradise of incorruptible freedom, democracy, and the rule of law in the, 30 years since Soviet rule ended. There are a lot of problems in that part of the world which really make much more sense to address those than to engage in great power confrontations with Russia over who controls Ukraine. Everybody who knows anything about European strategy knows that Ukraine is pivotal. It has been really since the rise of Germany. And in modern terms, Zbigniew Brzezinski, in his book *The Grand Chessboard*, says that the control of Ukraine is crucial. Now, control doesn't necessarily mean possession, but it does mean having strong influence over it. And if Russia felt that Ukraine had actually passed into the NATO alliance, it would be deeply alarmed.
So you actually just don't think there is going to, there's not an intention even to invade on the part of Russia?
Well, I don't know. I mean, if there is, then the people who have that intention are unhinged. It couldn't conceivably do Russia any good. And since Russia controls whether it invades or not, then if as a nation it does something so unhinged and self-damaging, then it could happen. But if it does, then it means that Putin isn't just a sinister tyrant and a man who's failed to curb the corruption in his country and certainly failed to establish or maintain a law-governed democracy, is also crazy. But I don't think at the moment we have any evidence of that. But an invasion of Ukraine would be the evidence. But it seems to me to be profoundly unlikely, because I see no sign that he is crazy.
Do you have many contacts with Russia now? Do you?
No, not really. I haven't even been there for a couple of years now, and the Moscow I knew is unrecognizable compared with the Moscow that is now. So no, but I keep in touch. I'm still interested, and I have this vague knowledge of the geography and the history, which enables me to see a bit beyond the sillinesses of what a lot of people write. This has been for many years a debate, though, in which it's been a positive disadvantage to know anything about the subject. The less you know, the easier it is to pile in.
Yes. I was just wondering, because I just wonder, we haven't had very much coverage during the past couple of years during this pandemic of certain parts of the world and how they've done. And I have no sense really of how Russia has handled, for example, the past 2 years.
Very badly. Very heavy-handedly.
But
it was among the most repressive in its initial. Yeah, but then again, it reached the stage where, as I was told by people I knew who were living in Moscow at the time, where a lot of people, unless they could actually be obscene by a police officer, stopped paying much attention. But the initial shutdown was pretty draconian. They didn't at all stand out from the rest of Europe in this. They went down the path of panic.
If you come back to Britain for a minute, again, we're awaiting, as you mentioned earlier, this report, the Sue Gray's report. Actually, no, you mentioned a public inquiry, I believe, Peter. Sorry, we're waiting for this moment.
Well, you've got to wait for the police now.
Yeah, it's quiet.
The Dick inquiry.
And Inquisitor Dick, and who I think you actually warned against, didn't you?
Years ago, yeah. I heard about, oddly enough, reading stuff written by my old friend David Rose, who in those days was quite keen on her. I thought this woman is going to be commissioner. I've got an old cutting somewhere predicting it so long ago that it's yellow. But I also said, before she was appointed, I said that there was evidence that she would be disastrous. I remember writing it and thinking, well, there'd be some fuss about this, because they hadn't actually picked her yet. This is 5 years ago now. And being amazed that nobody else joined in at all. That there was, although her record was, let's be polite, patchy in the extreme.
Patchy.
Nobody said. Is it wise to appoint this person to the most important policing job in the country? But no, she was duly appointed as predicted.
So now we're having to wait, aren't we, on this report because of...
Well, I don't know how it works, honestly, but it seems to me that if you've got two inquiries going, I suppose one is you have to work out which one is more important. And if an organ of the state to do with law enforcement, with the capacity to take a case to the Crown Prosecution Service and suggest that charges are preferred, if such an organ is involved, then presumably that takes precedence over a civil servant? I don't know. It's a mystery to me.
I think she to an extent is because she's the first woman and all of that. That was the reason. I remember at the London Assembly when I was on it for 5 years, having to scrutinise her and the police, and she was deeply unimpressed. A very nice lady.
Oh, perfectly nice, yeah.
Perfectly
Charming.
nice.
No, this isn't personal.
Yeah, but totally, at a loss. I felt, in with the statues thing and with the policing of the pandemic restrictions.
But she distinguished herself very early in her career with what might be very simply called left-wing policing, the sort of policing which makes compromises with demonstrators, which is more or less neutral between offender and victim, is not driven, as it used to be, by a strong idea of what is and what is not right. But it's the managing of society. I call these people paramilitary social workers, and she is the epitome of paramilitary social work.
Yes.
And they have the minds and attitudes of social workers, but they also have big truncheons.
Yes.
For some strange reason, baseball caps.
Yes, I know. It's just
A weird symbol of the new police. Who would have thought, after all those years of the admired British Bobby and his helmet, that we'd end up with the police force with baseball caps?
I know that my admiration.
So they were in Bucharest.
Yeah, my admiration's almost totally gone, I'm afraid. I don't even.
Well, people's admiration should go. My view is now quite straightforward. They should be replaced. We should train a new, proper police forces, genuinely local, genuinely locally controlled, genuinely dedicated to the enforcement of law without fear or favour, and we should swear in proper constables with a proper oath. And when we've assembled these new police forces, we should close down the old one. There is no other future, and if you don't do that, then this is just a gigantic failed nationalised industry, which simply does not fulfil the purpose for which we hired it.
Well, when she finally,
Oh, yeah.
Well, when we get these reports in it, all the rest of it, we're left with the government, and we're left with, people then sort of trying to hide themselves from blame and all of that. I wonder, another point where you've been completely consistent over the years, is in the way in which the Tory party, as it stands, is the greatest enemy of conservatism really in this country. I just wonder that because it is now being so reviled by its supporters for having gone so far, seemingly to the left, whether in fact this was possibly a chance that it actually might go, or that something else will come.
If it did, the only people who would win from it would be Sir Keir Starmer's Labour Party and the Scottish Nationalists. And that's the problem that we now face. I don't want to defend these people. I have no time for them at all. And for a long time, I've been perfectly happy to say that honestly, there's been no real choice between New Labour and the Conservative Party, because they were identical in politics. But at this particular moment, where Johnson is being attacked for dismantling some of the COVID autocracy, then those who are attacking him are my enemies. That doesn't make Johnson my friend.
Yeah.
And also, there is a grave danger that if people continue down this route, what we will get at the next election is Labour, I think, will struggle greatly to get a majority in Parliament by itself, but you will get the possibility of a pact between Starmer and Sturgeon.
Right, yes.
And I think that's something which hardly anyone of any sense could possibly desire.
But the point is, they always make this.
Can I just make a point about this? People say, "Oh well, he'll never do it," and once Scotland goes, he won't have a majority. But the point is that what the pact will be two ways. I mean, this has often happened in English history. Scotland could intervene on the side of radicalism, as it did during the Civil War, and you could have the Scottish nationalists delivering Keir Starmer a new constitution with proportional representation for the next parliamentary election, for instance, and the abolition of the second chamber in return for a promise of a referendum.
Yeah.
The possibilities of it are quite frightening if it happens. And it won't be a minor change.
But don't you think that people, it's got to come to the point where, the Tories at every election say, well, okay, if you don't vote for us, you're going to get him, right there. Whether it was...
Yeah, but that's so unconvincing when the person you're going to get has been for so many years identical. I mean, at one point, I would say that in the contest between David Cameron and Gordon Brown was more conservative than David Cameron. Certainly Ed Balls was, and certainly Gordon Brown was more hostile to the euro than David Cameron's ever been.
But therefore, shouldn't it be the case that basically people should be advised, well, actually, shouldn't they say, well, actually, okay, to always call their bluff and say, actually, we're not going, sorry, this time we're not voting for you. I mean, would you advise people not to vote?
I've for a long time, I urged abstention.
Abstention?
Yeah, so I think mass abstention would be the only effective way of contributing to, the only ethical and effective way of contributing to politics in this country. But whether I can continue, and this is the thing which now troubles me, this is purely a defensive thing, not an endorsement. But as at the moment, although I dislike Johnson and his government and think them useless, the last thing I want to do now is anything which would help Keir Starmer and Mark Drakeford and Nicola Sturgeon regain the levels of shutdown and restriction which they would plainly like.
Yes.
And of course, if they get rid of Johnson, that is quite possibly what will follow. The departure of Johnson is a victory for Sturgeon, Starmer and Drakeford.
The feeling I get at the moment is that he's kind of coming out the other side.
I have no idea. I can't read it, and it's impossible. I have no means of reading Parliament at the moment at all. I just think the disposition of forces. The reason why I'm taking a position which I find quite uncomfortable at the moment of saying I'm not in favour of Johnson. I'm not defending Johnson. No. I'm attacking his attackers, which I am, and people should be very, very wary of helping those attackers at the moment.
If there were to be, in an imaginary world, there was to be a Conservative Party that was actually genuinely conservative, do you think actually that the nature of Britain has changed to the extent that actually people would still vote for something like that?
No. No, I think we live in a post-revolutionary country and have done for some time. Right. And one of the things which revolutions do is they propagate themselves among the young. I think there are a few eccentrics under 30 who might conceivably have some idea of being conservative, but in general, the radical ideas of the Cultural Revolution have been absorbed and accepted by the vast majority of the population. There is no silent majority of conservatives. If there ever was, there hasn't been one for many years.
That's very interesting to hear, actually, because I suppose that you could say that with Brexit, for example, I know you weren't in favour of the referendum itself, but 52, 48, or whatever. Somewheres and anywheres, which tends to suggest that the somewheres are the silent majority, they're more likely to be, and that therefore they amounted to 52%.
But on an awful lot of issues, which would move me greatly, and those people would have been indifferent or quite possibly on the left-wing side.
Right.
I don't think it was actually a conservative coalition. It had some conservative characteristics, but an awful lot of the people who voted to leave the European Union were not people who were of the traditional conservative right in any other way. And it would be a serious self-delusion to imagine that they were.
So you think that basically, because we're, as you say, we're now living in a post-revolutionary state?
Oh, yeah.
That in fact, there just isn't the appetite or the desire.
There isn't the knowledge.
Or the knowledge.
People don't know what they've lost. They don't understand the nature of the regime under which they live.
You are, when we last spoke, you were writing a book about grammar school.
I still am.
Are you still?
Plod. Well, it's been a bit interrupted, actually.
Speaking of people not knowing, I had a grammar school education, and even though I hated school, that's not the point. It was a good. I could tell it was a good school. You learned all this kind of stuff. But you're talking about the 1960s.
That's amazingly long ago, isn't it? That's another thing about it. But what it did, I had to divert because I finally found what I'd been seeking for a long time, which is a really good account of the secondary modern schools.
Right.
And half of this argument is always, well, if you have the grammar schools back, you have to have the secondary modern schools back, which is, and everybody says, ooh, we can't have that, because people think secondary modern schools are some kind of do the boys hall misery establishments. In fact, a lot of this argument is obscured by the fact that secondary moderns were, not in all cases, but in many cases, perfectly good schools, and their faults didn't come from them being secondary moderns. They came, here's a fascinating thing, but you didn't know this. When the secondary moderns were first set up, they weren't allowed to take part in any examinations. For the first 15 years of their existence, they were excluded from any major examination, so there was no public examination to take. Which you would have thought wet left-wing liberals would think was a good idea.
Yes.
And in fact they did. It's one of the reasons why they accepted it, but it meant the schools were largely purposeless and shapeless. And when they began later on to be allowed to take examinations, a lot of them did quite well at it.
But with grammar schools, that is surely one thing it's not going to come back.
Well, possibly not. Who knows? I mean, I think, at the moment, I think the purpose of explaining what actually happened is to allow people to decide what they might want to do in future. But I think an awful lot of people are finding the academies a false dawn.
Yes, yes.
And they are, first of all, it's almost impossible to find out who really runs them. They don't seem to have, there doesn't seem to be any chain of proper ministerial or other public responsibility over them. Yeah. And the word academy doesn't really mean anything, does it? It doesn't. Yeah. It can mean a badly failing school, or it can mean a very successful school. It doesn't actually. It's not actually a transformation. It's just a shift in responsibility, and also it seems to be a shift in scrutiny. Yeah. And the private schools, which seemed to me to have had a bonanza as a result of the closure of the grammar schools, because they were able to pull in the middle class and get to pay quite large sums of money for an education which ought to have been free and no longer was, and have done fantastically well in watered-down examinations, because any well-organised school can clean up in the GCSE and A-level examinations of today. They're now becoming far too expensive for most middle-class people. And I don't know, it seems to me perfectly possible that those parents who want a good education for their children and are not oligarchs are going to become increasingly discontented with what they're being offered, and to wonder again whether it's possible that selection by ability might be the solution. I know it's a remote possibility, but if they at least know what happened between 1944 and 1965, then they might be able to come up with something. There are still important countries which do this, and Germany being the most important. No one can say Germany is an unsuccessful country or an ill-educated country or indeed a class-ridden country. On the contrary, nobody says that. But it has, in most of its splendor, it has selective secondary schools of the kind which we abolished.
One of the problems, one of the things we get all the time from viewers, and indeed from my own personal experience actually, is almost regardless of the form of the school, they all now have certain things that are taught, which basically a lot of people are extremely uncomfortable with. The whole identity politics agenda and all of this goes right through, but public school too. What do you think of the sort of growing discussion I hear here and there of the need for homeschooling? Do you think that is...
Oh, well, I think there is great hostility in British government towards homeschooling. And the recent Bad Man report, for instance, which Michael Gove commissioned, was a menace to it. But part of the problem with homeschooling is the whole phrase has taken on a completely different meaning since the shutdown. When so many people attempted some sort of education of their children at home, and that's what people think of as homeschooling. The idea of it, as it was before then, has been obscured by that. Also, there's an awful lot of children excluded from school who might now be being classified as being homeschooled. It's very different from the United States, where it's largely an evangelical Protestant movement, but it's been enormously successful. Huge numbers of most of the states permitted, huge numbers of children are homeschooled, and they claim some of the best scholarships at Ivy League universities. The levels of success in education are very high, and there are homeschool programs attainable from the USA about that. But of course, they're designed for the American system, which, for instance, doesn't have A levels. Has SATs for entry to universities, but it has not been a failure, and it's won a very strong legal position through very serious and devoted campaigning. It's a much bigger thing that's ever been here. Some people may say, well, they're much like evangelical Protestantism. Well, not everybody does, but they happen to be the people who were keenest on it because they felt that their attitude towards life was the one being most excluded from the American public schools. It's a fascinating thing, though. I mean, it was really getting going when I was living there, which is why I know a bit about it.
I think,
but I don't think it's in the nature of this country. I don't think that you need the sort of rebel spirit that you can find in certain levels of American society, which we don't seem to have, to really establish a powerful homeschooling movement, which does challenge the schools in general. I don't see it happening here.
Do you still see yourself as being Britain's obituarist?
I do. In fact, very kindly, I've often said to my publishers that all my books should be put into one huge black Dominic Sandbrook breeze block sized compendium.
Got one here.
Yeah, they're all enormous. I want an enormous book with a black cover with the obituary of Britain on the cover. And one of my loyal readers actually went and got this done and has sent me a rather fine but wholly unique copy of the obituary of Britain, which I possess. Yeah, that's what I am. I am the obituarist of Britain.
But would you say, this is being a bit fanciful maybe, but if it does come to pass that maybe Scotland and Wales go, all the rest of it, and we're left with England, that might be a different proposition?
Well, it might be. It would certainly be like that moment when the central heating goes off.
Yes.
And you can't switch it on again. You suddenly realise life is different.
Yes.
I think it will be, if it happens, and remember Northern Ireland is quite likely to go as well, it's the truncation of England back to itself, will be a pretty bracing blast. But whether there'll be anybody equipped to take advantage of it from a conservative point of view, I don't know. Where are the institutions? Where are the people? Where is the learning which would make that possible?
Do you think of yourself as English or British?
Well, actually, I'm Cornish.
Oh, okay.
So I
me.
have to be British, really.
Silly me. It's just one thing.
No. It's Hitchens is a Cornish name. Okay. I mean, it would be so much nicer if it were one of those romantic Poldark type Cornish names like Trevithick or Trelawney, but it's Hitchens. But it is a Cornish name. I mean, in the days when we still had phone directories, the one part of England where you could find more than two Hitchenses in the phone book was Cornwall. Okay. It's the Cornish version of Dickens. It means Richard's son, but it is a Cornish name. So it's nothing to do with that rather unpleasant, town in Hertfordshire.
Right, okay. Well, I think that you've sidestepped my question there a bit, but anyway.
Oh, no, I'm not. I can't. I have to be British, but I mean, obviously, Cornwall doesn't have the same sort of separate existence as Scotland and Wales. So I'm English.
Give it time.
Before I am. Yeah. But who knows?
Yes. Well, look, it's been great talking to you, Peter. Can you stay with us? Because for our exclusive members, we basically have just a few more questions to ask you. But anyway, thank you for this part of the interview anyway.
And I'll be here in the other part too.
Yes. That's all we have for this week on So What You're Saying Is. We shall look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.